You're listening to Talking Freely, where we discuss culture, politics, and religious freedom. Talking Freely is a podcast from Freedom for Faith, a Christian legal think tank that exists to protect and promote religious freedom in Australia.
Welcome to Talking Freely. My name is Rowan McHugh. My guest today is Michael Jensen, who is an Australian clergyman, author, and lecturer. He has served as the rector in the Anglican parish of St Mark's Church, Darling Point, since 2013, and was formerly a professor of theology at Moore College, Sydney. Michael, welcome to Talking Freely.
Oh, thanks for having me, Rowan. It's great to be here.
In your training as a theologian, and given your presence as a public Christian over the last decade or so, who do you regard as your spiritual mentors that have most shaped your approach to public Christianity, and how have they done so?
Wow, there's quite a few. I think, can I start with Augustine? Although that's going a long, long way back. I should start with the Apostle Paul, of course, but I'll start with Augustine because I think Augustine's great book, The City of God, is an extraordinary treatise on the intersection between the world and the kingdom of heaven, and how these two realities exist side by side. And it's a model for knowledge of the culture in which he lived, and yet insistence on the reality of the gospel. It's a model of looking for the kingdom of heaven, not trying to put the kingdom of heaven, build the kingdom of heaven on earth. So he's a realist. He's a Christian, what I call a Christian realist, the old Augustine, which makes him appealing to me. And he's not utopian. And I think his vision is a great antidote to sort of the various utopianisms that we find. Now, I'd flash forward to the 20th century, and in terms of public theology, I mean, everybody says C.S. Lewis, but I think C.S. Lewis, in his Mere Christianity, which were originally a series of lectures he gave during the Second World War, on the radio, on the BBC, did a remarkable thing because he was able to distill the essence of Christianity without denominationalism or tribalism. And I think that meant that he gained a hearing for a reasonable Christianity, which really had it goes without saying he had a significant impact. But I think his impact on the Christianity that followed the Second World War is, I think in history we'll see it as being more and more profound and more and more significant. And then more recently, one of my teachers was a man called Professor Oliver O'Donovan, who I studied under at Oxford. And he's perhaps not a public theologian in the sense that he would appear in the newspapers, but his understanding of politics and Christianity and his Christian view of politics is absolutely formative for me, partly because he generates it from an extraordinary reading of the whole Bible, the whole of the scriptures. And I guess partly I found that he agreed. He kind of gave meat to the answers I already suspected were correct. You know, I don't think I ever found O'Donovan something where at one level, I wasn't prepared to agree with him, but he also, once again, is just such a good reader of books, a good reader of books that aren't necessarily in agreement with him. He's so comprehensive, and I think that's a model for Christian public engagement: is his humanizing and respecting of others. And from him I learnt that you can find what I call surprising friends. That is, all truth is God's truth, and so you should be unsurprised when you find somebody who you perhaps wouldn't you wouldn't agree with on a lot of things actually says something which resonates. And so keep an eye out for those surprising friends. And then more latterly, I was taught by a man called Bruce Smith at Moore College, who's very, didn't publish very much, but certainly just worked at the interface between Christianity and the world in a way which was rich, engaging, and profound. And then the American preacher, Timothy Keller in New York, who, like me, is a preacher as well as having been a theologian. And so I find that he can do this job in the pulpit. And that's a difficult thing to do because you don't have very long, I guess. But also to be able to grow a church as he has in New York, which is probably one of the most hostile environments to contemporary Christianity, shows how good he has been at speaking into the contemporary culture with his vision of the gospel.
Again, from your training as a theologian, in your view, is religious freedom for all faiths something the historical church has permitted? And can it rightly be derived from the Bible?
Now, that's a great question, because you can't. The Bible is not a book of. It's not a tract for general human rights, and certainly, when you look at the Old Testament, Israel was not to be tolerant of other faiths at all. Ancient Israel is not a place for religious freedom, and not in the slightest. And then when it comes to the New Testament, by the way, there's no sense in which all paths are the same to the one God, and all paths are not equal. So on the face of it, Christianity, like many other religions, believes it is the right path, the one path to heaven, to God. And so you might not think that the Bible is a Bible which would generate a concept of religious freedom. But there's two sources for religious freedom that come out of the Bible. One is the Apostle Paul's experience in the Acts of the Apostles. And as he travels around the ancient world, the Greco-Roman world, the Roman Empire, he is imprisoned and persecuted, and he is beaten, and he is hounded out of town, and yet he continues courageously to preach a message of liberation, the message of the gospel, the good news of Christ. And at one stage, of course, he appeals to his own Roman citizenship and says, you've got to protect me here. And he makes appeal to the emperor, and because he wants to, of course, to preach to the emperor. So we see him going around the place, being hounded for what he does in the public square, and we see his courage. And I think just from his example, I think we generate the sense, the narrative is telling us that the suppression of Paul's preaching is something that a civil society would not do. That allowing him to preach is a good thing. So there's that kind of story, but then there's the concept inherent in his gospel that you can't coerce faith. That faith is a matter of that faith is a matter of the internal, the person inside. It can't be compelled or coerced. And so, in his letter to the Galatians, Paul talks in particular about this. Says, "For freedom, Christ has set us free." That is his great message there. The gospel is a gospel of liberation. It liberates us from external constraints. It is a word that is believed with our hearts, and so you can't compel that, and neither can you compel it to be stopped. And so Christians over the centuries have seen from the nature of faith itself, that you can't suppress it and you can't coerce it. You ought not to. And so religious freedom is then something that you ought to promote, because you want the persuasion of the God. You need the persuasive environment of the gospel for the gospel to actually do its work. Now, in particular, Protestants advocated for this, partly through the tensions of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th and 17th century. And after the sort of the bloodbaths of the 16th and 17th century, John Locke, a Christian philosopher, in particular, wrote about religious toleration from biblical and theological principles. He's in one sense one of the founding fathers of contemporary liberalism, and he spoke very, very strongly for religious freedom because of this, the nature of faith, that is something that you cannot compel or coerce. And so in order for it to flourish properly, you ought to allow freedom of religious expression, even freedom of those religions that you don't agree with.
I want to turn to history. Since the 1990s, what social and cultural changes have you noticed most acutely in Australia?
I don't think they've been different, that Australia has been different from the West. In fact, maybe that's a change in the sense that we are perhaps less unique than we ever were. We are very much part of global patterns of culture. And so I think what happens in the US and in Europe and in England is very much, and Canada very much happens to us, even though we have our own kind of conservatism. I think since 1990, I think we've seen a more active movement for people to disaffiliate with their religions, so that religion is less tribal. So that is in particular the attack on the nominals, people who were probably never attending church but would have said that they were Anglican or Catholic. And because I think of the increased exposure of the increased revelations of the child abuse, that's not been a very difficult task. That increasingly more, if you identify as a Christian, you are as a Catholic or Anglican or a Christian, you are more likely to be an actual believer than to have just a tribal affiliation. Your parents may have identified as Catholic, and you now identify as nothing. So the nothings have grown. I think biblical ignorance has grown. So people don't have a knowledge of even basic knowledge of the Bible. So they're quite surprised when things are quoted to them from the Old Testament, and they assume that Christians must believe chapter and verse from Deuteronomy. And so they don't have an idea that the Bible is a whole. And so that level of ignorance is now a norm, even amongst intelligent people. And I increasingly encounter, again, intelligent, well-informed people who just assume that the church is very much dying. So when I tell them that there are more than 250 people in my church on a Sunday, they are absolutely gobsmacked. Their assumption is that there are just a few old ladies, and so they very much, there's an assumption, I think, that Christianity is on the wane. And then now, whereas even in the 80s, to say you had Christian values meant you were an ethical person. Now that nexus is becoming difficult. That it's not as easy to say that. There is a felt tension between what Christians might say and what an ordinary person in the street might say is ethical. And so, in fact, the churches are increasingly seen, Christians are increasingly seen as part of the problem rather than as part of the solution.
Touching a bit more there on what you said about that shift, Christians feeling their views have moved from the weird category to the dangerous category. In your view, is persecution an experience of Australian Christians? And do you think it exists in the West more broadly?
I think we should be very careful about the word persecution, because I think it's persecution is in one sense a systematic oppression, often, pardon me, you would say violent. I think it is tough. it is tough to be a Christian, and there is a cultural dissonance for Christians, for faithful and Orthodox Christians now, which we are feeling that wasn't there before. I think it's still the case. Look, we've got to remember, we've had premiers and prime ministers who are open about their Christian faith. We still have a lot of cultural cachet. You know, there's still you could point to the writers and composers and artists who have Christian faith or express a Christian faith. So I'd want to hesitate. I think also, before saying we're persecuted, I think it's important for us who lead the church not to catastrophize here, because I think an over anxious response to a cultural change does not help us in the church. I think trials and temptations exist for the church wherever and whenever. The trial and the temptation for us now is not complacency, because that's what it used to be, that we were kind of culturally normative and people thought the people in the church were good people. Now, increasingly, as I said before, we're seen as dissonant, and potentially the bad guys are potentially dangerous to children, maybe. So that dissonance is what we're feeling. I don't yet see what I would call persecution. I think it's around the fringes sometimes. So I know that people are, for instance, in the workplace, in the major banks, for instance, felt very afraid of saying that they were opposed to same-sex marriage. That's not quite the same, I would have thought, as, and I think that would be very difficult for you to, it's difficult for you to out yourself in that way, but I don't think that's quite yet what we might say is happening in Saudi Arabia or in Libya. It's not, or North Korea. And so persecution is a word I'm nervous of using.
When you look at the Christian church in Australia, does it indicate the same social divisions and disagreements as the world around it? And if so, why do you think that that's the case?
Yes, one of the funny things is, of course, the church is, one of the things we need to remember is that the church is itself a part of the society it's in, and often reflects the same divisions, the same fault lines and the same cultural tendencies. I think it's not an accident, if we look carefully, that the church can exhibit similar divisions. Then there's a couple of things here. I think Tom Holland's amazing book Dominion kind of illustrates it very well, because he shows how at one level both left and right understandings of our society and ethical visions, what Charles Taylor would call our social imaginaries, actually emanate from the same source. So that Christianity is at the fountainhead of both conservative and progressive visions. He's got this last chapter of his book, Woke, actually shows how the woke vision of things is very much informed by Christianity. You couldn't imagine feminism without Christianity. Feminism, for example, emerges in a culture which values compassion and equality. So it doesn't emerge. It's no accident that it doesn't emerge from Islamic culture. It emerges from a culture which has been listening to the word to the Bible for the last several hundred years. So it's interesting that there's a sort of both and going on with that, and I think that's true even of our two major political parties. I think there are Christian reasons. There's Christian heritage with the Liberal Party. There's a Christian heritage that informs the ALP. I think that's true of the Greens as well. Even you might say the in Western Australia and Tasmania, especially, there were Mennonite and Quaker people and church communities that were foundational for the Green Party. So, interestingly enough, and so I think those divisions are present when we walk into the church space as well. I think also it's because no one political vision fits the church neatly. So I think the best, most biblically informed view of the political landscape is never quite captured by either side. And so you'll always find Christians saying, hang on a minute, conservative side of politics is just too brutal, and it's just not sympathetic enough to refugees. It's missing out. It's got a blind spot when it comes to social justice. And you'll always find people on the right side of politics in church saying, well, the progressive side just seems to have overlooked the issues of, has overlooked or neglected issues like the abortion issue. It has been too cozying up too much to a secular version of progressive politics.
You mentioned the notion of wokeness there, which is an issue that continues to plague the American church and is beginning to make waves here. These critical theories are beginning to play out in social justice. How would you guide confused Christians through the vexed question of structural claims of racism and sexism in light of their Christian faith?
Well, I think, first of all, I would want Christians to return to what the Bible says about these things and to speak biblically about them, rather than to speak in the terms of whatever critical theory is saying. And I think Christians, if they return to the scriptures, will find things to say that are that are not so far out of whack with those visions, but will be able to do so in a balanced and authentic way that just doesn't sign up to the whole project behind critical theories. I think also we'll want to find surprising friends. I hope that Christians are not racist, in fact, are appalled by racism. And also that Christians, on the basis of their doctrine of original sin, will understand that sin impacts and infects social structures. We have been saying this for 2,000 years, and in any case, and we ought to believe it. But we want to say more than that too. We'll also say, by the way, that sin draws a line straight through the human heart individually, and so it's not just a matter of social structures. And in fact, the key thing we need to do is to change hearts. And changing hearts, in fact, leads to changing social structures. Changing social structures doesn't change hearts. So I think we've got a different sort of a remedy. And I think also we've got a gospel which allows for forgiveness, reconciliation, and second chances. And I think the tone of much political debate coming from the left in this form is deeply unforgiving, and it is also apocalyptic. It is hard to see it doing anything but inflaming conflict, because it allows no room for a shared vision. I mean, interestingly, Martin Luther King, when you read him, a vision for social justice for the races, and in particular for African American people, based on the Bible, he appeals to common humanity. Whereas you don't get that now. What you get is, I'm a victim who's oppressed and I need to overturn this, and you're an oppressor. And I don't think that leads anywhere helpful, to be honest. So I'd like Christians to, I don't want to be caught in the trap, by the way, of being on the opposite side of the fence. I don't want to be heard as if I'm endorsing racism. But I'm not sure that I want to sign up to the whole campaign of Black Lives Matter either.
Quoting from a recent article of yours on the Archbishop-elect, you say, the problem here is not that the church needs to get with the times or that it needs to upgrade its views. The problem is that it always ends up fighting on terms set for it by others. It is perpetually on the back foot, and it never sounds like it has good news to share. Could you give some examples of how churches do this, and also your vision for the right kind of engagement?
Oh, well, I was just pointing out problems in that piece. I think it's difficult, right? So I think it's difficult because we're anxious. It's difficult because it's easier to see problems than it is to see solutions. But we need to remember that we've got good news to share, and the good news is for all. So while we are saying that we don't think that, um, uh, for instance, that where we hesitate about the ideology surrounding transgender activism, we are also, we're not, our business is not to tell people that they're wrong. Our business is to tell people that there's saving good news, that there's actually a better way, that there is a deeper salvation, that there's a God who loves them and who died for them. And so our concern for our concern on these matters comes from that place. It doesn't come from a vision of purity or from simple prejudice, and so that's got to be the angle into which a Christian, the angle from which a Christian speaks. I was concerned in my own synod a couple of years ago. We produced a doctrinal statement about transgender issues, and the doctrinal statement, however, said a lot of things why we don't. There's a lot of reasons why we don't think that transgender activism is right, but said nothing about the gospel being good news for all people, including those experiencing gender dysphoria or who want to change their gender. So, and that's not our job. Is not to moralize. Our job is to preach the good news. So it has to, whatever we say has to be framed in gospel terms. That's difficult, and it takes intellectual work. It's going to take intellectual work. It takes good rigorous theological thought to make that happen. And also a lack of, as I say, I've said it again, I've said it a number of times already, a lack of anxiety about the state of affairs. Because we believe in a sovereign God, we don't have to be warding off. Our job is not to kind of morally correct and morally police our society. Our job is to share the good news, which also has, by the way, the bad news that we're fallen and sinful creatures. It's to defend the poor and the widow and the orphan, to speak for those who are voiceless, and to say what is right. But we can do so in a way which is engaging and wisdom and compassion, wise and compassionate.
Quoting again from your article, Christian morality is not the same as society's general moral sense. However much people speak of Christian values or admiring the teachings of Jesus, when it comes down to anything that matters, like money, power, and sex, sharp divergences appear. Now that plausibility structures of sacred views are giving way to suspicion or opposition in Australia, what are some examples of some of these sharp divergences that will appear?
Yeah, well, I mean, the obvious one is that the Christian position is that sex is for marriage between a man and a woman. Sexual activity, that's where that's the Bible's view. That's the Orthodox Christian view. Increasingly, of course, we've been fighting that out through in the context of homosexuality. But the real issue, because that's such a small minority of people anyway, real issue is that even Christians don't believe this anymore. And so even Christian parents are telling their young people that it's okay to cohabit before, even as a Christian, it's okay to cohabit. In fact, it's wise to cohabit, despite the fact that even statistics don't back that up, that they should cohabit. And so I find that it's even normative, this is normal amongst Christians. So Christians have lost their sense of what being a Christian disciple is. And so whenever we speak on these issues, we're at a very, very, we're really poking something that really is sensitive for our society. Our society, as Carl Trueman shows in his book this year, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, it's in the area of sex that our society has chosen in particular to say, this is how your self is expressed in its full agency, freedom, and pleasure. And so whenever we say anything in that area, we are accused of this is when people start saying that we're encouraging suicide. And so Christian values are, people are now afraid of what a Christian might say in youth group. Right. So I've actually had conversations with parents in my area who are not Christians, and they said, oh yeah, I used to go to youth group back in the 70s. It would be good for some, wholesome behavior and for my kids to make friends with other kids in an environment where they're not going to get drunk and have, and where boys are going to mistreat girls. But, they teach, I hear they still teach really ancient views of sex and sexuality, and I don't want my kid to learn those. So I don't want my kid to be repressed in that way. So that's particularly a pointy-ended, a matter of real clash. What was interesting in a couple of years ago when the Archbishop of Sydney encouraged headmasters and headmistresses from around Sydney to sign a letter, the heads of Anglican schools to sign a letter promoting religious freedom, the backlash from ex-students was extraordinary, because the ex-students said, I didn't think that was my school. That wasn't the school I signed up to be an old boy and old girl of. I thought it had great values, and I now understand that it has these other values, and that's horrendous. And I'm a good person, and these people are not good people. So you see this also with The Handmaid's Tale, interestingly. How often I've heard The Handmaid's Tale referenced, and The Handmaid's Tale is sort of, I think, what a lot of secular people think our churches are like. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. So I think they think that's what we would like society to be like.
Just touching on some of the things you referred to earlier, I'm curious about whether you think there is a way to righteously fight for institutions. Commentators seem to feel that as truth deteriorates, it's not just the church that loses, but mankind in light of competing anthropologies. What would you say to those who feel safer, softer approaches are synonymous with a kind of surrender that only hurts our neighbours? Perhaps the quintessential case is transgender transitions that you touched on earlier, where drugs and procedures can cause irreversible damage to adolescents.
This is very difficult. I think, remember, our task is not supremacy. Our task is not to Christianize our society. Our task is to witness to Christ. That may mean working out how to lose well. I think of this over euthanasia legislation. I suspect that euthanasia legislation is going to sweep the country before too long, and it will be unstoppable. I think the numbers are just against us. I don't think there's going to be, I think it's just going to take hold in every state of Australia before, I can't see that being reversed. I think it's disastrous. I think it's appalling. I hate it with all my heart. I think it's disgraceful for the lack of compassion it shows the old and the way it puts the most vulnerable in harm's way. But I think we can stoutly negotiate for the strongest possible protections and advocate for better funding for palliative care treatment, and also be those who just behave differently. The other thing is true, I think, likewise with the transgender issue. There's two things. One is actually remember that there are people who aren't Christians who are fighting that fight. So this isn't necessarily just our fight to fight. It's not. It's a civil war even within progressive politics, and so there's more going on here than just the church against the world. I think again, framing what we say in terms of the compassion for those who stand to suffer, those who stand to lose most, is crucial. And also, it's like how I would say I pastor people too. Someone might come to me and say, "What's your advice here?" And I would say, "Don't do that. I think that's actually sinful behaviour." But once they've done it, I don't abandon them. And I think that's true too. I think there's going to be a raft of children who enter into their 20s, terribly scarred and hurt by their experience at the hands of these doctors who are gaining financially and through their manipulation of children. And I don't want to be there saying, "Told you so." I don't want to be there judging and condemning those people who've made those appalling, or who've been led as teenagers to make these appalling decisions, irrevocably hurting their own bodies. But I want us to be the community that actually does not abandon those, but actually is the community of welcome and kindness to those who will need us. And so that's what we need to practice doing.
A seminary professor from America that we had on the podcast felt that accusations of being a culture warrior was leveled more at conservatives and was unfairly lopsided in its use. He said that fighting for institutions risks putting one in a position of being so accused, but that attempting to love one's neighbour requires this kind of engagement that stops the deterioration of conditions around us. What's your view on this?
Well, I'd say, I wholeheartedly believe in the defence of institutions, the necessity of institutions, but I'd say institutions, particularly those that Christians have run, have to realise how much social capital they've lost through their own fault. That is, it's all very well for us to say, there's this attack on social institutions, and it's from outside, but we shouldn't blame them. We've given them so much material to work with, right? So there needs to be a wholesale repentance so that we can actually be trustworthy again. It's very hard to defend social institutions that are so indefensible, so deeply corrupt, and so unwilling to listen to criticism. It makes the job of the progressive campaigner all the easier. So I think if you want to rebuild, if you want to defend these institutions, reform them, make them more trustworthy, would be the first step. Because I think the sound of defending them just doesn't sound authentic against a person, against the many narratives that have come out. I mean, Christians are not the trade union movement. The trade union movement is a case in point. Workers, without trade unions, workers are exploited. It's a terrible thing not to have a strong trade union movement. But the trade union movement has been corrupt. So it's been very easy to dismantle it. Nobody really wanted it. They've been a byword for bullying and corruption. So the trade union movement is very weak in Australia and elsewhere. And I don't think that actually is healthy. The banks are very, again, likewise, banks and corporations, not trusted. And instead what we have is the trust, we trust celebrity instead. And that's a terrible, hollow alternative, isn't it? So yes, I'd say we need to defend social institutions because the most vulnerable need them. A society without proper authority is a society with either tyranny or anarchy, and so we need to practice proper authority, the proper exercise of Jordan Peterson would call it competence. With a Canadian accent, he'd say competence. And we need competence. We need competent leadership which has integrity, and institutions that work in that way. So get good at doing those.
I want to turn to your own podcast, With All Due Respect, that you host with Megan Powell-Dutoit. After time spent with Megan, who approaches Christianity a little differently, what wisdom can you offer on how Christians in your Reformed Anglican tradition can understand different approaches to justice and practice?
Yeah, interesting. I've enjoyed very much doing the podcast with Megan. I'd hasten to say that Megan is a fully orthodox Christian in terms of her trust in the Bible and in her faith, which is a Baptist Arminian style of faith. So we differ perhaps on the structure of salvation slightly, although Arminians and Calvinists have been working in concert as evangelicals since the rise of the evangelical movement in the 18th century. And it's really that what I would call consensus evangelicalism that I hope the podcast recaptures, because it's when Christians have worked generously together, with generosity with one another, on the basis of a shared understanding of the Bible and a shared understanding of the authority of Scripture and the Lordship of Christ, that we've been able to, that the gospel has been heard. I think we will differ on politics, because I think it's actually open for Christians to disagree on political things. I think there are other areas, church practices such as the ordination of women. Again, I think there should be an openness to disagree without denying one's convictions. And I think also in the midst of a society which has lost the ability to disagree, partly because this idea of truth itself is so contested, that Christians have an opportunity to practice disagreement in a different kind of way, such that in and of itself it commends Christ. Because as Christians, our claim is not to know everything. Our claim is that Christ knows everything. So it's okay. It's okay for me to sit down with someone with some disagreements over those things. I shouldn't fear that. I don't have to give up my integrity or my views in order to have a conversation with Megan that is meaningful, and in a way that meaningful, helpful, edifying, and constructive, and from which I may indeed learn. So that's the point of the project of the podcast. Is actually it's got a mission kind of feel to it, because I want Christians to not to get over our anxious response to cultural pressure, which is to become more and more divided and less coherent. Billy Graham is one of our great models here. The Billy Graham Crusades that came to Australia, and of course went around the world, were a model of this kind of cooperation for the sake of Christ.
And with your thumb on the pulse of the relationship between the church and the Western world, what do you foresee as the future of Christianity in Western countries?
I think it's extremely dangerous to forecast, to be in the business of prophecy in this sort of way. But I'm not entirely gloomy. That is, I think I'm not optimistic about there being more and more white-skinned believers. I think we've lost a generation of Anglo and Anglo-Irish believers here in Australia and elsewhere. But as these cultures become more and more multicultural, you'll find that Christianity does not disappear. That Christianity becomes more, it just becomes more more various. The Christian face will be I'm going to say a coloured face. I'm aware that may not be the politically correct term, but I think, for instance, in Sydney, increasingly Southeast Asian faces will dominate in our local Christianity. But I think Australia is becoming more and more a Southeast Asian country anyway. So I'm kind of optimistic, because I think those cultures are far more receptive to the gospel at the moment, as are the islander cultures, and numbers of people from India as well. So those churches are growing, and those people groups are becoming more and more evident as leaders of our churches, as we've seen in our Anglican church, where we've just appointed a Sri Lankan immigrant as our archbishop, and we've got 2 bishops of Asian descent out of 5. So I think we're an interesting snapshot of the future of Christianity in the West. On the other hand, I would also say that it's worth challenging the secularization thesis, and also the narrative which says that Christianity is becoming less and less dominant, and in a kind of gradient that extends from the Enlightenment till now, because actually the church has waxed and waned, so that the 1930s was a low point, the 1950s was a high point. Our trouble is we tend to read history from the 1950s and not go back to the 1930s, where there was not much church attendance. Or, for instance, Charles Simeon, the great evangelical preacher, in the early part of the 19th century, might have been the end of the 18th, went to a Christmas service at Westminster Abbey, and there were only 6 people there. And yet, in the 19th century, the evangelical movement took hold of the Anglican Church, and then the Anglo-Catholic movement, and there was enormous revival, as well as the nonconformist revival. So the Christian faith, in terms of numbers of people in church, waxes and wanes, and there may be decades where we don't have many people in church, but there may be decades, God willing, where that trend reverses. We've seen with COVID, by the way, that the unforeseen may change everything. And I'm already sensing a bit more interest in Christian answers, a kind of sense of the vacuity of the secular. And I've seen this too with the latest sexual assault crisis that's been spreading in the eastern suburbs where I live. Again, a kind of questioning of how could we have let young people have so little understanding of sexuality. Surely, now we've given them sexual freedom, they should just have worked it out, and they should understand that consent is enough. But there's a moment of doubt in the secular mind, I think, and so who knows what God may have in store.
Michael Jensen, thank you very much indeed for being with us today on Talking Freely.
Thank you very much for having me, Ryan.
That's it for our latest episode of Talking Freely. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can do so through our website, www.freedomforfaith.org.au. Freedom for Faith exists through the generous donations of individuals and organisations across Australia. If you'd like to financially partner with us, you can do so through our website.